Ever feel like those tricky coding interview questions? Like you need some secret genius code to even have a shot.
I can definitely see why it feels that way sometimes.
Yeah, you're staring at a blank page, the clock is ticking, and suddenly all those elegant solutions you thought you knew just vanish from your brain.
It's like your brain is playing hide and seek at the worst possible moment.
Exactly. But here's the good news. You've sent over some notes from this article, the bulletproof formula for solving any coding question. And it turns out there are some practical strategies that can make a huge difference. No magic wands, just solid techniques that anyone can learn. And that's what we're diving into today, those practical strategies.
Absolutely. The article does a fantastic job of breaking down this common problem, feeling overwhelmed by what seem like brilliant solutions. Instead, it offers a structured approach, a sort of framework that anyone can apply. And it all starts with a surprisingly powerful first step, something the article calls embracing brute force.
Okay, brute force, that sounds a little intimidating, right? Like, are we talking about smashing our keyboards here?
Not quite. Brute force in this context is really about starting with the most straightforward solution you can think of, even if it's not the most elegant or efficient. Think of it as laying the groundwork.
So it's about getting something, anything, working first.
Precisely. Let's say you're dealing with a classic coding problem like the two-sum problem. You have an array of numbers, and you need to find two that add up to a specific target number. A brute force approach would be to simply check every single possible pair of numbers in that array until you stumble upon the magical duo that hits your target. It's like trying every key on your keychain until you find the one that unlocks the door.
Okay, I can see how that would work, but it doesn't exactly scream efficiency, does it?
You're absolutely right, and that's where the real magic of embracing brute force comes in. By starting with this almost clunky approach, you actually gain valuable insights into the problem itself. You start to see where the bottlenecks are, where the inefficiencies lie.
So by seeing what's not elegant, you start to understand how to make it more elegant.
Exactly. It's like sketching out a rough draft. It might not be pretty, but it gets the basic ideas down and it highlights the areas where you can add detail and refinement.
So let's take this back to the two-sum problem. What kind of bottlenecks might we bump into with a brute force approach?
Good question. In the two-sum problem, the biggest bottleneck is going to be all those comparisons. You're potentially looking at the same numbers over and over again as you iterate through the array, which eats up time and processing power.
So that's where those more sophisticated solutions, the ones that make our heads spin, come into play.
Exactly. Once you've identified the bottleneck through your brute force exploration, you can start thinking about more elegant ways to address it. In this case, you might consider using a hash table, which is a way of storing information that allows for much faster lookups. It's like having a perfectly organized filing system instead of rummaging through a messy drawer every time you need something.
That's a fantastic analogy, and I love how this approach takes the pressure off of trying to be brilliant right out of the gate.
Exactly. The article really emphasizes that it's about having a process, a framework that you can rely on.
And that framework is about breaking down these intimidating challenges into smaller, more manageable steps, right?
Absolutely. It's like climbing a mountain. You don't just teleport to the top, you break the climb down into manageable camps. And that brings us to the next pillar in the bulletproof formula.
Which I have a feeling is going to involve some fruit, based on these notes.
You're one step ahead of me. This next part is all about simplification, and it involves a pretty clever analogy using, you guessed it, fruit arrangements.
Okay, before we dive into the fruit basket, let's quickly recap what we've learned about brute force. It's not about finding the most elegant solution right away. It's about understanding the problem and identifying areas for optimization.
Exactly. And now, with that solid foundation in place, we can move on to simplification. This next part of the article uses a pretty clever analogy, using, you guessed it, fruit arrangements. Imagine you have this basket of different fruits, and your task is to arrange them in a line. But here's the catch. No two fruits of the same kind can be next to each other. It's like a fruity puzzle.
Oh, okay. I can see how that could get pretty complicated, especially if you have a big basket of fruit. Where do you even begin to simplify something like that?
You're right. Tackling the entire fruit basket all at once would be overwhelming. This is where the article encourages us to break down the problem. What if, instead of starting with every type of fruit, you began with just one? Picture a single apple. Pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
Then introduce a second fruit, maybe a banana. Now you need to think about their order, ensuring they alternate. As you add a third and then a fourth kind of fruit, you begin to see patterns emerge, making the overall task less daunting.
It's kind of like those logic puzzles, where you have to figure out who lives in which house based on a bunch of clues. You don't try to solve the whole thing in one go. You break it down, starting with the most obvious pairings, and then use that to make deductions about the rest.
Exactly. And this gradual increase in complexity allows you to make sense of the problem without getting bogged down by the big picture.
Hmm?
Plus, you might notice interesting things along the way. For instance, you may realize that it's usually a good strategy to start with the type of fruit you have the most of. That way you have more flexibility later on down the line.
That makes a lot of sense. It's all about working smarter, not harder. But I have a feeling that even with these techniques, sometimes we hit those moments where we're just stuck staring at the screen, unsure of how to translate our thoughts into code.
You're absolutely right. That's where the third pillar comes into play, and it's all about the power of stepping away from the keyboard and picking up a pen and paper.
Because as much as we love our digital devices, sometimes there's no substitute for good old-fashioned writing things out, right?
Exactly. The article stresses that working through those smaller examples manually, especially during a high-pressure situation like a coding interview, can make a world of difference. It helps you visualize the problem, literally seeing those fruits lined up on paper. Plus, it allows you to experiment with different arrangements, play with ideas, and that process often sparks those aha moments, revealing patterns you might not have noticed by just thinking about it abstractly.
So if we think about it in terms of the two-sum problem, instead of wrestling with code right off the bat, we can sketch out a simplified version of the problem.
Precisely. Let's say your target number is 10. You could jot down a small array of numbers like 2, 7, 5, and 8. Then just use your pen to visually try different combinations, adding them up as you go. This not only helps solidify your understanding of the problem, but it also primes your brain to start recognizing those underlying patterns that might lead to a more elegant coding solution.
It's like you're giving your brain a way to physically interact with the problem, turning abstract logic into something tangible.
Exactly. And when you're in the heat of a coding interview, that shift from mental juggling to visual manipulation can be a game changer for your clarity and confidence.
It's like the difference between trying to explain a complex route verbally versus just whipping out a map. Suddenly, it all clicks into place.
I like that analogy. You know what's interesting about this bulletproof formula is that it's not about picking just one of these techniques and sticking with it. The real power comes from weaving them together, using each one to support and enhance the others.
So it's not a case of brute force or simplification or pen and paper, but rather a synergistic blend of all three.
Absolutely. Think of it like this. You start with your trusty brute force approach to get a handle on the problem and identify any glaring inefficiencies. Then you bring in simplification to break down that potentially overwhelming challenge into smaller, more digestible chunks. And all along the way, you're using that pen and paper to visualize, experiment, and really solidify your understanding.
It's like each technique provides a different lens through which to view and understand the problem, and by combining those perspectives, we arrive at a much clearer, more holistic solution.
Precisely. You're no longer just memorizing algorithms or hoping for a flash of genius. You have a repeatable system, a framework that empowers you to tackle even the most intimidating coding interview questions with a sense of strategy and purpose.
And I imagine that the more you practice these techniques, the more intuitive they become, almost like second nature.
Absolutely. It's like learning any new skill. Initially, you're consciously thinking through each step, but over time, as you gain experience and confidence, those steps become almost automatic, and you're able to solve problems more fluidly and efficiently.
Speaking of practice, the article touches on a few other key points that are worth highlighting. Patience, for example. It's so easy to get discouraged when you're staring at a problem that feels impossible to crack, and I'm sure even the most experienced programmers have those moments, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even seasoned professionals don't always have all the answers right away. What sets them apart is their ability to remain calm under pressure and systematically work through the problem. They've internalized these problem-solving techniques to the point where they can break down even the most complex challenges into manageable steps.
And sometimes that involves starting with a solution that seems almost too obvious, too simple. Like maybe that brute force approach isn't as inelegant as we initially thought.
Exactly. Sometimes the most elegant solution, the simplest one, or at least it serves as a crucial stepping stone to something more refined. The key is to be open to all possibilities and not get hung up on finding the perfect solution from the get-go.
So to recap for our listeners today, we've delved into this bulletproof formula for tackling coding interview questions, and it all boils down to three core pillars. Embrace the power of brute force, simplify complex problems into manageable chunks, and don't underestimate the power of pen and paper for visualizing and experimenting with solutions.
And perhaps even more importantly, we've learned that it's not about being a coding wizard overnight. It's about having a system, a framework that allows you to approach any problem with confidence, knowing that you have the tools to break it down and find an effective solution, one step at a time.
You know, it's funny how this bulletproof formula actually applies to so much more than just coding interviews. It's a valuable problem-solving strategy that we can all benefit from in various aspects of our lives, whether we're tackling a complex work project, navigating a challenging situation, or even just trying to assemble some ready-to-assemble furniture without losing our minds.
Absolutely. It's all about breaking down those initially overwhelming challenges into smaller, more manageable steps and having the confidence to tackle them one by one.
So next time you're facing a coding challenge, or any challenge for that matter, remember the bulletproof formula. It might just be the secret to unlocking your inner problem-solving ninja. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive, but keep those mental gears turning because there's always more to learn, more to explore, and we'll be back soon with another deep dive into the fascinating world of knowledge.